The morning mist clung to the limestone walls of Mycenae as the scribe Alcestis pressed his stylus into the soft clay tablet, his weathered hands steady despite the tremor in his heart. The year was 1180 BC, though he would not have known this date. Time was measured by kings and harvests, not by the abstract numbers that future archaeologists would assign to these final, desperate years. Outside his window, in the archives complex, the great cyclopean walls that had protected his city for centuries cast long shadows across the citadel, their massive stones fitted together by hands that seemed to belong to giants. But Alcestis was not thinking about walls or giants as he carefully inscribed the inventory of bronze weapons needed for coastal defense. His mind was on the disturbing reports filtering in from across the Aegean. Cities burned, populations fleeing, the very fabric of their interconnected world beginning to fray. If you use these videos to fall asleep, subscribe so you don't miss any new ones. Leave a comment with your thoughts on the video and any suggestions you have for future ones. The tablet he held would be among the last administrative records ever written in Mycenaean Greek, though he could not have imagined that the sophisticated writing system he had spent decades mastering would soon disappear entirely, not to be deciphered again for over 3 millennia. This is the story of civilization's first great collapse, a catastrophe so complete that it would erase kingdoms, silence writing systems, and plunge much of the known world into centuries of darkness. It is a tale not of simple conquest or single disaster, but of a perfect storm of calamities that would bring down an entire international system in just 50 years, teaching humanity its first hard lesson about the fragility of complex societies. To understand the magnitude of what was lost, we must first appreciate the remarkable world that existed before the collapse. The Late Bronze Age, stretching roughly from 1550 to 1200 BC, represented humanity's first truly globalized civilization. From the sun-baked plains of Egypt to the mountainous heartland of Anatolia, from the island fortresses of the Aegean to the cedar-covered hills of Lebanon, a web of trade, diplomacy, and cultural exchange bound together the ancient world in ways that would not be seen again for centuries. At the center of this web sat the great powers: Egypt under the new kingdom pharaohs, the Hittite Empire controlling most of modern Turkey and northern Syria, Mycenaean Greece with its palatial centers scattered across the Aegean, and the rising kingdoms of Mesopotamia. These were not primitive societies, but sophisticated civilizations with advanced metallurgy, monumental architecture, complex writing systems, and bureaucracies that would make a modern tax office seem simple by comparison. The Mycenaean palaces alone employed dozens of scribes who meticulously recorded everything from sheep inventories to bronze allocations, land tenure disputes to religious offerings. These men, and they appear to have been exclusively men, though the evidence is frustratingly sparse, represented the pinnacle of Bronze Age literacy, masters of the linear B-syllabic script that captured the earliest known form of Greek. Each morning, scribes like our fictional Alcestis would take their places in the archives complex at Pylos, or the throne room at Knossos, or the administrative quarters at Mycenae, ready to record the countless transactions that kept their complex societies functioning. They tracked the movement of precious metals from Cyprus, recorded the arrival of amber from the distant Baltic, and documented the distribution of luxury goods from across the known world. But these scribes were more than mere bookkeepers. They were the nerve system of Bronze Age civilization, the human connections that made possible the coordination of resources across vast distances. When a Hittite king needed grain from Egypt, when a Mycenaean wanax required tin for bronze production, when a Levantine merchant arranged for cedar wood to be shipped to the Nile Delta. It was scribes who made the records, tracked the shipments, and maintained the accounts that kept this ancient global economy functioning. The archaeological remains of their work tell a story of breathtaking sophistication. At Pylos alone, over 1,000 linear B tablets have been recovered, representing just a fraction of what must have once existed. These tablets reveal a palace economy of stunning complexity, records of land tenure, military preparations, religious festivals, craft production, and international trade that paint a picture of a society as bureaucratically sophisticated as any in the ancient world. But the tablets also reveal something else: the ephemeral nature of this administrative system. Recent analysis suggests that most Linear B records were temporary documents meant to be kept for less than a year before being discarded or recycled. This was not a civilization that built archives for posterity, but one that lived perpetually in the present, managing the complex flow of resources and information needed to sustain their interconnected world day by day. The first signs of trouble came not from human enemies, but from the skies themselves. Across the eastern Mediterranean, the weather began to change in ways that would have profound consequences for civilizations built on the careful management of agricultural surpluses. Pollen samples from across the region tell a story of rising temperatures and declining rainfall, while tree ring data from Anatolia reveals a pattern of increasingly severe droughts. For the Hittite Empire, which controlled the breadbasket regions of central Anatolia, these climatic changes spelled disaster. Tree ring analysis using the Gordian chronology shows that between 1230 to 1200 BC, the region experienced a series of droughts culminating in 3 consecutive years of severe conditions between 1198 to 1196 BC. For a civilization that had successfully weathered individual droughts and famines throughout its history, this sustained period of agricultural failure represented an existential threat. The Hittite archives from Hattusa preserve the desperation of these final years. Tablets record urgent requests for grain from Egypt, diplomatic marriages arranged partly to secure food supplies, and frantic irrigation projects, as the royal administration struggled to maintain agricultural production in an increasingly hostile environment. Queen Puduhepa, wife of Hattusili III, personally negotiated grain shipments from Pharaoh Rameses II, while Egyptian irrigation experts were dispatched to Anatolia in a futile attempt to revive the region's failing agriculture. But the climate crisis was not confined to Anatolia. Paleoclimatic evidence suggests that the entire eastern Mediterranean experienced a period of unusual heat and drought during the late 13th century BC. The Dead Sea, fed by the Jordan River, and rainfall in the surrounding highlands dropped by more than 50 meters, indicating that even the relatively well-watered Levant was experiencing severe water stress. For civilizations that had grown accustomed to managing agricultural surpluses for trade and population support, these climatic changes created a cascade of problems. Reduced agricultural output meant less food available for urban populations, fewer resources for trade, and diminished capacity to support the specialists, scribes, craftsmen, soldiers, administrators, who made complex civilization possible. As one modern analysis notes, at 3 consecutive years of drought, hundreds of thousands of people, including the enormous Hittite army, would face famine, even starvation. Yet climate change alone cannot explain the Bronze Age collapse. The great civilizations of the late Bronze Age had weathered droughts before, had survived individual famines, and had demonstrated remarkable resilience in the face of environmental challenges. What made this crisis different was not any single factor, but the way multiple pressures combined and amplified each other. in what scholars now describe as a perfect storm of calamity. While modern attention often focuses on climate change and military invasions as causes of the Bronze Age collapse, recent research has highlighted a crisis that may have been even more fundamental: the ancient world's first energy shortage. The late Bronze Age was, contrary to popular imagination, not a low-energy civilization, but an intensely fuel-dependent one, built on the systematic consumption of wood on an industrial scale. The production of bronze itself was extraordinarily energy-intensive, requiring sustained temperatures above 1,000 degrees Celsius to smelt copper and tin. This heat could only be achieved by converting timber into charcoal, a process that consumed staggering amounts of wood. Recent estimates suggest that producing a single ton of bronze required 10 to 15 tons of timber, not including additional fuel for mining, refining, and transport. When multiplied across the thousands of tons of bronze produced annually by late Bronze Age civilizations, the scale of wood consumption becomes almost incomprehensible. This was not merely a problem of supply, but of logistics. A Bronze Age city of 40,000 people would have required 2,400 to 3,600 tons of timber every month, just for basic cooking and heating, before accounting for industrial uses. Meeting even a fraction of this demand by sea would have required more than 100 ship arrivals per month, year-round, along often dangerous routes where shipwrecks were common. The famous Uluburan shipwreck, one of the largest known Bronze Age cargo vessels, carried only about 20 tons, roughly the load of a modern semi-trailer. As forests around major population centers were exhausted, Bronze Age civilizations found themselves caught in an energy trap. The sophisticated metallurgy that made their military and economic superiority possible required ever-increasing amounts of fuel, while the sources of that fuel were located at ever greater distances from the centers of consumption. The maritime networks that supplied timber became bottlenecks that could paralyze entire economies when disrupted by storms, warfare, or simple mechanical failure. This energy crisis helps explain one of the most puzzling aspects of the Bronze Age collapse: why so many different civilizations failed simultaneously, despite having different enemies, different climate pressures, and different internal problems. As energetic and logistical margins narrowed, the knock-on effects multiplied. Bronze production became intermittent as fuel ran short. Palaces that had justified their authority through redistribution could no longer provide for their people, and the complex systems that held Bronze Age civilization together began to break down from within. In the archives of Ugarit, one of the great trading cities of the Bronze Age world, archaeologists have discovered some of the most poignant documents in human history. Letters written as civilization itself was collapsing around their authors. These clay tablets, fired by the very flames that destroyed the city, preserve the desperate communications of the last generation to witness the Bronze Age world in its full glory. King Amurapi of Ugarit, whose name would be forgotten for 3 millennia until French archaeologists rediscovered his capital, wrote with increasing desperation to his allies as the crisis deepened. To the king of Alashia, Cyprus, he penned words that seemed to echo across the centuries. "My father, behold, the enemy's ships came here. My cities were burned, and they did evil things in my country. Does not my father know that all my troops and chariots are in the land of Hatti, and all my ships are in the land of Luca?" The letter reveals the tragic irony of Ugarit's situation. Its military forces were away helping the Hittites fight other enemies when the city's own moment of crisis arrived. This was not simply bad timing, but symptomatic of the interconnected nature of Bronze Age civilization that made local problems quickly become regional disasters. When the Hittite Empire called on its vassals for military support, Cities like Ugarit were obligated to respond even if it left them vulnerable to other threats. Another letter, perhaps the last diplomatic communication ever sent from Ugarit, captures the city's final moments. When your messenger arrived, the army was humiliated, and the city was sacked. Our food in the threshing floors was burnt, and the vineyards were also destroyed. Our city is sacked. May you know it. The simple, devastating repetition, "Our city is sacked. May you know it," conveys the writer's struggle to comprehend the enormity of what had befallen his world. But these were not just royal communications. Throughout the Bronze Age world, evidence suggests that the sophisticated communication networks that had bound the great powers together were breaking down. Egyptian records speak of messages that went unanswered, diplomatic missions that failed to return, and trade relationships that simply ceased without explanation. The Amarna letters, which provide such rich detail about international relations in the 14th century BC, have no equivalent in the 13th and 12th centuries, not because archaeologists have failed to find them, but because the system that created them had ceased to function. For the scribes who maintained these communication networks, the breakdown of international correspondence represented both a professional crisis and a personal tragedy. Men who had spent their lives facilitating communication between kings and kingdoms found themselves recording the collapse of everything they had worked to maintain. The last Linear B tablets from Pylos include records of military preparations, watchers guarding the coast, that suggest the palace administration knew the end was approaching. In the administrative quarters of the great Bronze Age palaces, the scribes continued their work even as the world crumbled around them. These men, whose names are lost to history, but whose work provides our clearest window into the collapse, maintained their meticulous records even in the face of approaching catastrophe. At Pylos, the scribes' final tablets reveal a bureaucracy struggling to comprehend and respond to an unprecedented crisis. Military records show preparations for seaborne attack, with detailed listings of personnel assigned to coastal watch stations. Economic tablets record desperate attempts to gather resources for defense, including the mobilization of bronze that would normally have been used for tools and jewelry to create weapons and armor. The physical properties of these final tablets tell their own story of crisis. Recent analysis has revealed that many were hastily written, with less care taken in their formation and firing than earlier records. Some tablets show evidence of being broken and reused, suggesting that even clay, normally abundant in the Aegean world, had become a precious resource. Perhaps most poignantly, some tablets show evidence of scribes breaking from their strictly professional roles to include personal observations. One tablet from Mycenae bears a small sketch of a human figure on its reverse side, the only known depiction of a person on a Linear B document. Was this a scribe's attempt to preserve something of humanity in the face of systematic collapse? We can only speculate, but the image suggests that even the most bureaucratic minds were struggling to process what they were witnessing. The scribes' work patterns also changed dramatically during the final years. Where earlier tablets show evidence of careful planning and systematic record-keeping, the final documents suggest an administrative system in chaos. Different scribes began working on the same types of records, suggesting that normal administrative hierarchies were breaking down. The careful spatial organization that had characterized earlier archive deposits gives way to seemingly random scattering of tablets, as if the normal procedures for filing and storage had been abandoned. Modern analysis of the Linear B corpus suggests that the palace economies collapsed so quickly that normal record destruction procedures were abandoned. Unlike earlier periods, when tablets appear to have been systematically discarded after their information was no longer needed. The final records were preserved only because the buildings that housed them burned down before the scribes could follow their usual practices. For these anonymous scribes, the collapse represented not just political disaster, but the end of their entire way of life. The complex administrative systems they had spent their careers mastering would disappear so completely that when Greek civilization reemerged centuries later, it would be based on entirely different principles of organization and record-keeping. The sophisticated bureaucracy that had made Bronze Age palace economies possible would be replaced by much simpler systems that had no need for professional scribes or centralized record-keeping. In the royal courts of the Bronze Age world, the late 13th century BC brought increasingly disturbing reports from across the known world. For kings and queens who had grown accustomed to managing their realms through careful diplomacy and trade, the mounting crisis represented a challenge unlike any their dynasties had faced. At Hattusa, the Hittite capital carved from the living rock of central Anatolia, King Suppiluliuma II, whose name would be the last recorded in the royal annals of one of history's great empires, struggled to hold together a realm under unprecedented pressure. The climate crisis that gripped Anatolia had undermined the agricultural base of Hittite power, while external enemies pressed on multiple frontiers. Yet recent archaeological evidence suggests that Suppiluliuma and his court may have seen the end coming earlier than previously thought. Rather than fighting a desperate last stand in their mountain capital, the royal administration appears to have conducted a systematic evacuation, removing valuable objects, important records, and key personnel before the final destruction. When archaeologists examine the burned ruins of Hattusa today, they find evidence of a city that had already been largely abandoned when the final fires consumed it. This planned abandonment represents one of the most intriguing aspects of the Hittite collapse. Unlike the sudden destructions that befell other Bronze Age centers, Hattusa's end suggests a leadership that recognized the futility of their situation and chose strategic withdrawal over hopeless resistance. But where did they go? Some evidence points to a migration southward into Syria, where Neo-Hittite kingdoms would emerge in the early Iron Age. Others suggest that the royal court may have established new capitals in more defensible locations, though no clear archaeological evidence has yet confirmed this theory. In Egypt, the pharaohs of the New Kingdom faced their own mounting pressures. While Egypt would ultimately survive the Bronze Age collapse better than most civilizations, the costs of defense against repeated invasions by the Sea Peoples strained even the resources of the richest kingdom in the ancient world. Rameses III, often considered the last great pharaoh of the New Kingdom, spent much of his reign fighting desperate battles against seaborne invaders whose origins and motivations remain mysterious. The Egyptian records of these battles, preserved in the mortuary temple at Medinet Habu, provide some of the most detailed contemporary accounts of the Bronze Age collapse. The reliefs show not just military encounters, but entire populations on the move, men, women, and children traveling in ox carts, accompanied by fleets of ships with distinctive curved prows. These were not mere raiding expeditions, but migrations of displaced peoples seeking new homes in an increasingly unstable world. For the Egyptian scribes who recorded these events, the invaders represented something unprecedented in their experience. Previous enemies had been identifiable peoples with known kingdoms and understandable motivations. The Sea Peoples, by contrast, seemed to emerge from nowhere, speaking unknown languages, following unfamiliar customs, and demonstrating military techniques that Egyptian armies had never encountered. No aspect of the Bronze Age collapse has generated more debate among scholars than the identity and role of the enigmatic Sea Peoples. Egyptian records from the reigns of Merneptah and Ramesses III describe devastating attacks by confederations of seafaring peoples, with names like Peliset, Chikir, Shekelesh, and Denian, names that echo faintly in later historical records, but provide few clues to their origins. For decades, historians envisioned the Sea Peoples as a great horde of barbarian invaders sweeping down from the north to destroy the civilized world. This interpretation fit comfortably with older models of historical change that emphasized conquest and migration as the primary drivers of cultural transformation. The Sea Peoples became the ancient equivalent of the Germanic tribes that would later overwhelm the Roman Empire. External enemies whose superior military prowess brought down civilizations grown soft with prosperity. Modern scholarship has painted a much more complex picture. Rather than external conquerors, many sea peoples may have been refugees from collapsing regions. Mycenaean Greeks fleeing the destruction of their palatial centers, Anatolians displaced by the fall of the Hittite Empire, or Levantine populations forced to migrate by climate change and political instability. As one scholar puts it, the Sea Peoples were essentially dispossessed victims of the disturbances at the end of the Late Bronze Age, including but not limited to a devastating pandemic and prolonged drought, who migrated to other regions in search of greener pastures. This reinterpretation transforms the Sea Peoples from agents of destruction into symptoms of a much broader crisis. The same forces that were undermining Bronze Age civilization, climate change, economic disruption, political instability, were also creating massive refugee populations who had no choice but to seek new homes wherever they could find them. Their attacks on Egypt and other surviving kingdoms were not necessarily motivated by conquest, but by the desperate need for resources and territory. The Egyptian reliefs at Medinet Habu support this interpretation by showing family groups with all their possessions, not just military forces. Women and children accompany the warriors. Ox carts carry household goods. And the overall impression is of entire populations on the move rather than armies on campaign. For the Egyptians who faced these migrations, the distinction between refugees and invaders may have been largely academic. Armed populations seeking to settle in Egyptian territory represented a threat regardless of their motivations. Some Sea Peoples groups may indeed have originated as Bronze Age elites forced to take to the sea when their own kingdoms collapsed. Mycenaean nobles whose palaces had been destroyed, Hittite administrators fleeing the abandonment of Hattusa, Levantine merchants whose trading networks had been disrupted. All of these displaced elites would have possessed the resources, knowledge, and motivation to organize seaborne migrations. The mysterious nature of Sea Peoples' ethnicity may reflect the cosmopolitan character of late Bronze Age civilization itself. In a world where international trade, diplomatic marriage, and cultural exchange had created mixed populations in major centers, the collapse would have produced refugee groups that defied easy ethnic classification. A Mycenaean refugee might speak several languages, follow mixed religious practices, and have family connections across multiple kingdoms. Of all the cities destroyed during the Bronze Age collapse, none provides a more vivid picture of civilization's final moments than Ugarit. This great trading center on the Syrian coast had been one of the most cosmopolitan cities of the ancient world, a place where merchants from Egypt and Mesopotamia, Anatolia, and the Aegean mingled in markets filled with luxury goods from across the known world. The last days of Ugarit can be reconstructed in extraordinary detail thanks to the clay tablets found throughout the city, documents fired by the very flames that destroyed the buildings that housed them. These tablets preserve not just official correspondence, but private letters, business records, and even school exercises that provide a window into daily life during the final crisis. The picture that emerges is of a city struggling to comprehend the magnitude of the disaster overtaking it. Early tablets record routine business transactions and diplomatic communications, suggesting that life continued normally even as reports of trouble filtered in from other regions. But gradually, the tone changes. Military preparations begin to appear in the records. Trade relationships are disrupted, and the language becomes increasingly desperate. One of the most chilling aspects of Ugarit's destruction is the evidence for how quickly the end came. Recent analysis suggests that the final attack may have occurred within days or even hours of the last diplomatic communications being sent. A letter from the king of Ugarit to the king of Cyprus desperately reports enemy ships approaching the coast, while another tablet, apparently written after the destruction began, simply states, "Our city is sacked, and may you know it." The archaeological evidence confirms the written record's testimony of sudden, violent destruction. Throughout the residential quarters of Ugarit, archaeologists have found 32 arrowheads scattered in the streets and houses, along with javelin heads, bronze daggers, and pieces of armor. This was not a siege that dragged on for months, but urban warfare conducted street by street, house by house. Perhaps most tragically, some tablets suggest that help was on the way when the attack occurred. Letters indicate that Hittite forces had been dispatched to assist Ugarit and that other allies were preparing to send aid. But these reinforcements arrived too late. By the time they reached the Syrian coast, Ugarit was already in flames. The destruction was so complete that the city was never rebuilt. For 3,000 years, the ruins lay buried under sand and debris until French archaeologists rediscovered them in the 1920s. The cuneiform tablets they found, preserved by the heat of destruction, remain our most intimate record of how Bronze Age civilization came to an end. By 1200 BC, the carefully maintained networks that had bound Bronze Age civilization together were collapsing with accelerating speed. What had begun as regional problems, drought in Anatolia, political instability in Greece, economic pressures in the Levant, had become a system-wide crisis that no individual kingdom could address through traditional means. The interconnectedness that had been Bronze Age civilization's greatest strength now became its greatest vulnerability. Trade disruptions in one region cascaded through the entire network. Military crises created refugee populations that destabilized neighboring areas, and economic problems in major centers reduced demand for products throughout the system. At Mycenae, the great citadel that had dominated southern Greece for centuries, the final years brought desperate attempts to shore up defenses against an increasingly dangerous world. The famous Lion Gate, which had welcomed diplomatic missions and trade caravans for generations, now looked out on a landscape increasingly filled with smoke from burning settlements. Archaeological evidence suggests that up to 90% of small sites in the Peloponnese were abandoned during this period, indicating a massive depopulation of the Greek countryside. The palace scribes at Mycenae continued their work until the very end, but their tablets reveal an administration under enormous strain. Records speak of bronze being collected for weapons rather than tools, of emergency taxation to fund military preparations, and of desperate efforts to maintain contact with other Mycenaean centers as communication networks broke down. The careful administrative procedures that had characterized earlier periods gave way to hasty records and emergency measures. Similar patterns can be seen throughout the Bronze Age world. In Assyria, normally one of the most militaristic societies of the ancient world, kings found themselves unable to maintain their traditional aggressive policies as internal rebellions and external invasions overwhelmed their resources. In Babylonia, the last Kassite rulers lost control of much of their territory as local governors stopped acknowledging central authority. Even Egypt, protected by desert barriers and the wealth of the Nile, found itself stretched to the breaking point. The costs of defending against repeated Sea People's invasions drained the royal treasury, while the breakdown of international trade networks deprived Egypt of many luxury goods that had become essential to court life and religious practice. Though Egypt would survive the Bronze Age collapse, it would never again achieve the international dominance it had enjoyed during the New Kingdom period. Behind the grand narrative of collapsing empires and burning cities lay individual human tragedies on an almost incomprehensible scale. For the millions of people who lived through the Bronze Age collapse, the experience would have been one of watching everything familiar and stable in their world disappear. Consider the experience of a Mycenaean priestess like Erytha, whose name appears in the Linear B tablets from Pylos. As a high-ranking religious official, she would have controlled substantial resources, owned slaves, and played an important role in the administration of her community. The tablets record her involvement in legal disputes over land, her supervision of craft workers, and her participation in the complex religious festivals that marked the Mycenaean calendar. But by 1180 BC, Erytha's world was collapsing around her. The palace that had supported her position was struggling to maintain basic functions. The trade networks that had supplied luxury goods for religious ceremonies were breaking down, and reports of destruction were arriving from other Mycenaean centers. Did she understand that she was witnessing the end of a way of life that had existed for centuries? Or did she hope, like so many in similar situations throughout history, that the crisis would pass and normal life would resume? For ordinary farmers and craftspeople, the collapse brought different but equally devastating challenges. The palace economies that had dominated Bronze Age life depended on complex systems of redistribution and specialization. Craftsmen who had spent their lives making luxury goods for international markets suddenly found no buyers for their products. Farmers, who had grown accustomed to palace-organized distribution systems, discovered that the administrative apparatus that had coordinated their activities had simply disappeared. Urban populations faced perhaps the greatest challenges. Cities like Ugarit, Mycenae, and Hattusa had grown far beyond what local agricultural production could support, depending on complex trade networks to supply basic necessities. When those networks collapsed, urban residents faced a stark choice: migrate to rural areas, where subsistence agriculture might be possible, or remain in cities that could no longer support large populations. The archaeological record suggests that most people chose migration. The dramatic population decline evident in Greece and Anatolia during the 12th century BC reflects not just mortality from warfare and disease, but the abandonment of settled communities as people sought more sustainable ways of life. Some regions appear to have lost 75% or more of their population, though it's unclear how much of this represents actual demographic decline versus dispersal to areas that have left fewer archaeological traces. For the lucky few who possessed portable skills or resources, the collapse may have offered unexpected opportunities. Merchants with knowledge of multiple languages and trade routes, craftsmen with specialized technical knowledge, or military leaders with loyal followers might have found their services in demand among the successor societies that emerged from the ruins. But for most people, the Bronze Age collapse meant the end of everything they had known, and the beginning of a much harder, simpler way of life. The collapse of Bronze Age civilization had profound implications for human technology and knowledge. The sophisticated metallurgy that had given the period its name required not just raw materials, but extensive networks of specialized knowledge that took generations to develop and maintain. When the palace economies that supported these specialists disappeared, much of their expertise vanished with them, The production of bronze itself became increasingly difficult as trade networks collapsed. Bronze requires both copper and tin, metals that are rarely found in the same regions. The tin sources that supplied Bronze Age civilization were located in distant regions, possibly Afghanistan, Cornwall, or Central Europe, and required complex logistics to transport to copper-producing areas in Cyprus or Anatolia. When these trade networks broke down, bronze production declined dramatically throughout the former Bronze Age world. Ironically, this shortage of bronze may have accelerated the adoption of iron technology. Contrary to popular belief, iron is not inherently superior to bronze for most applications. Good bronze is harder, more durable, and doesn't rust. But iron ore is much more widely available than the copper and tin needed for bronze, and iron production requires only local resources rather than international trade. As bronze became scarce and expensive, communities that had been peripheral to Bronze Age civilization found they could arm and equip themselves with locally produced iron tools and weapons. The collapse also led to the loss of writing systems throughout much of the affected regions. Linear B disappeared entirely from Greece and wouldn't be deciphered until the 1950s. Hittite cuneiform vanished from Anatolia. Even in regions where writing survived, literacy rates appears to have declined dramatically as the palace schools and scribal bureaucracies that had maintained these systems disappeared. The loss of written records had cascading effects on other technologies. Much specialized knowledge in Bronze Age societies was preserved in written form. Recipes for metallurgy, astronomical observations, mathematical techniques, engineering practices. When the institutions that maintained these records collapsed, the knowledge they contained was lost, often for centuries. However, the collapse was not entirely destructive in technological terms. Some innovations that had been developing within Bronze Age societies, but had been overshadowed by existing technologies, found new opportunities. Ironworking, as mentioned, became dominant, not because it was superior, but because it was more accessible. Alphabetic writing, which had been invented during the late Bronze Age, but remained a specialized tool for merchants and diplomats, spread widely during the recovery period, because it was easier to learn and use than the complex syllabic systems of the palaces. In the centuries following the Bronze Age collapse, much of the former civilized world entered what archaeologists term the Dark Ages, a period characterized by reduced population, simplified material culture, loss of monumental architecture, and the disappearance of written records. This was not merely a political transition, but a fundamental transformation of human society across vast regions. In Greece, the collapse was particularly severe. The sophisticated Mycenaean palaces were abandoned. Their administrative systems disappeared, and the population scattered to small rural settlements. Linear B writing vanished so completely that when Greeks began writing again centuries later, they used an entirely different alphabetic system borrowed from the Phoenicians. Monumental stone architecture ceased, artistic styles became simpler, and luxury goods virtually disappeared from the archaeological record. The contrast between Bronze Age and Dark Age Greece is stark. Where Mycenaean sites had featured massive fortifications, multi-story palaces, and sophisticated frescoes, the settlements of the Dark Ages consisted of simple single-room structures, housing extended families. Where Bronze Age Greeks had participated in international trade networks and maintained diplomatic relations with distant kingdoms, Dark Age communities appear to have been largely isolated and self-sufficient. Yet recent archaeological work has revealed that the Dark Ages were not uniformly dark. Some regions and communities fared better than others, maintaining higher levels of organization and cultural sophistication. The island of Euboea, for example, appears to have maintained relatively stable populations and economic systems throughout the transition period. Its residents would be among the first Greeks to emerge from the Dark Ages, establishing colonies in the Western Mediterranean and resuming contact with Near Eastern civilizations. Population patterns during the Dark Ages suggest that most people chose security over sophistication. Large urban centers were abandoned in favor of small, defensible settlements that could rely on local resources. Trade declined to minimal levels, with most communities producing what they needed locally, rather than depending on exchange networks that had proven so vulnerable to disruption. This fragmentation represented a rational response to the collapse of centralized systems. The palace economies that had dominated Bronze Age life had created efficiencies through specialization and exchange, but they had also created vulnerabilities. When the complex systems that coordinated these activities broke down, communities that had relied on them faced starvation and chaos. The turn toward local self-sufficiency, what scholars term autarky, sacrificed efficiency for resilience. The social implications of this transformation were profound. The hierarchical societies of the Bronze Age, with their royal courts, professional administrators, and specialized craftsmen, gave way to more egalitarian communities based on kinship and reciprocity. Wealth differences that had been enormous in Bronze Age societies became much smaller in Dark Age communities. Professional specialization declined as most people became generalists, capable of producing what their families and communities needed to survive. Not everyone suffered equally from the Bronze Age collapse. Some individuals and communities managed not just to survive, but to thrive in the new circumstances. Their adaptability and resources allowing them to take advantage of opportunities created by the breakdown of older systems. Merchants appear to have been among the most successful survivors. Their knowledge of languages, trade routes, and foreign customs made them valuable intermediaries in a fragmented world. Even when long-distance trade declined dramatically, there remained demand for their services in facilitating exchange between communities that had become more isolated. Some merchants may have established themselves as local leaders, using their international connections and accumulated wealth to build new power bases in the post-collapse world. Anecdotal evidence from Assyria illustrates the resourcefulness of Bronze Age merchants. Even as the Assyrian Empire was being torn apart by civil war and invasions, Assyrian merchants managed to acquire exotic animals from distant lands for their king's zoo, including apes and crocodiles. Their ability to travel through hostile terrain and return with such unwieldy cargo demonstrates the kind of adaptability that would have served them well during the broader collapse. Some geographical regions also proved more resilient than others. Areas that had been peripheral to Bronze Age palace economies sometimes found themselves better positioned to weather the crisis. The Greek island of Euboea, previously a Mycenaean backwater, became a refuge where small family farms banded together for collective defense. Centuries later, the Euboeans would be among the first Greeks to emerge from the Dark Ages and establish new colonies in the wider Mediterranean. Mountain peoples, who had always lived somewhat apart from Bronze Age civilization, may have suffered least from its collapse. Their communities were already organized around kinship groups and local resources, making them less dependent on the complex systems that failed. Some mountain regions that had been sources of metals or other raw materials for Bronze Age markets may have maintained higher levels of prosperity by continuing to export to whatever markets remained. Pastoral nomads represent another group that may have benefited from the collapse. The breakdown of centralized authority and the abandonment of many settled areas created new opportunities for mobile populations. Groups that had previously been marginalized or controlled by palace states found themselves free to expand into territories that had been densely settled. The distinction between refugees fleeing collapse and nomads taking advantage of new opportunities may often have been impossible to draw. Women's experiences during the collapse would have varied enormously depending on their social position and circumstances. Elite women, like the priestess Eritha, who had controlled substantial resources in Bronze Age society, would have lost their positions when the palace systems that supported them disappeared. But women with practical skills, midwifery, textile production, food processing, may have found their services in high demand in communities struggling to maintain basic functions. Of all the great powers of the Bronze Age world, Egypt alone managed to maintain its independence, territorial integrity, and cultural continuity through the crisis. But this survival came at an enormous cost that would fundamentally transform Egyptian civilization and its role in the ancient world. The Egyptian records of the Sea People's invasions, preserved in the mortuary temple of Ramesses III at Medinet Habu, provide some of the most detailed contemporary accounts of the Bronze Age collapse. But they also reveal the enormous military and economic strain these defenses placed on the Egyptian state. Ramesses III fought no fewer than 5 major campaigns against various Sea Peoples groups, victories that drained the royal treasury and exhausted Egypt's military resources. The economic impact of these wars was devastating. Egypt had grown wealthy, partly through its role as a hub in international trade networks, importing raw materials from Africa and exporting luxury goods throughout the eastern Mediterranean. When these networks collapsed, Egypt lost not just trading partners, but many of the specialized products that had become integral to Egyptian civilization. The elaborate court ceremonies and religious festivals that had characterized New Kingdom Egypt became impossible to maintain at their previous scale. Egypt's responses to the crisis reveal both the strengths and limitations of Bronze Age state systems. The pharaonic government was capable of mobilizing enormous resources for defense, building new fortifications, equipping large armies, and organizing complex military operations. But these same capabilities made it difficult to adapt to changed circumstances. The bureaucratic and military structures that made Egypt powerful also made it inflexible. The costs of survival were reflected in Egypt's gradual withdrawal from international affairs. The New Kingdom pharaohs had maintained military garrisons and administrative centers throughout the Levant, asserting Egyptian influence as far north as the Euphrates River. But the wars against the Sea Peoples forced Egypt to abandon these expensive foreign commitments and focus on defending the Nile Valley itself. This retrenchment marked the effective end of Egypt's role as a great power in the ancient Near East. While Egypt would continue to exist as an independent kingdom for many more centuries, it would never again achieve the international dominance it had exercised during the New Kingdom period. The third intermediate period that followed was characterized by internal division, reduced resources, and growing isolation from the wider world. Yet Egypt's survival also preserved important elements of Bronze Age civilization that were lost elsewhere. Egyptian writing continued to develop. Egyptian art maintained its distinctive character, and Egyptian religious traditions survived largely intact. In a world where so much knowledge and culture had been destroyed, Egypt served as a repository of ancient wisdom that would influence later civilizations. The Egyptian experience illustrates one of the central paradoxes of the Bronze Age collapse. The societies that tried hardest to maintain their existing systems often succeeded in the short term, but exhausted themselves in the process. Those that adapted more quickly to changed circumstances sometimes lost their distinctive character, but were better positioned for long-term recovery. Egypt's survival was real and significant, but it came at the cost of transformation into something quite different from what it had been during the height of Bronze Age civilization. While most Bronze Age civilizations struggled to survive the crisis of the late 13th and early 12th centuries BC, one group managed to turn collapse into opportunity. The Phoenicians, based in the coastal cities of modern Lebanon, emerged from the wreckage of the Bronze Age world to create one of history's most successful trading networks. The Phoenicians had been important but secondary players in the Bronze Age international system. Cities like Tyre, Sidon, and Byblos had served as intermediaries in trade networks dominated by the great powers, Egypt, the Hittite Empire, and Mycenaean Greece. They had provided cedar wood for Egyptian temples, purple dye for royal garments, and ivory carvings for Mycenaean palaces. When the palace economies collapsed and the great powers withdrew from international trade, the Phoenicians found themselves free to expand into markets that had previously been closed to them. Their cities had suffered less damage than major centers like Ugarit or Mycenae, partly because they were less directly involved in the military conflicts that characterized the collapse period. More importantly, the Phoenicians possessed advantages that served them well in the post-collapse world. Their traditional focus on maritime trade made them less dependent on overland networks that had become dangerous or impossible to maintain. Their city-state organization, based on independent urban centers rather than centralized kingdoms, proved more flexible than the hierarchical systems that had dominated Bronze Age politics. The Phoenicians also benefited from technological innovations that were spreading during the collapse period. The development of efficient alphabetic writing, which was much easier to learn and use than the complex scripts of Bronze Age palaces, made it possible for merchants to maintain records and communications without depending on professional scribes. Ironworking, which required only local resources rather than international trade networks, allowed Phoenician cities to equip themselves without depending on bronze imports. By the 10th century BC, Phoenician traders had established settlements throughout the western Mediterranean. Their colonies in Spain provided access to silver mines, while settlements in North Africa offered strategic bases for further expansion. The famous city of Carthage, founded by Phoenicians from Tyre, would eventually become one of the most powerful states in the ancient world. The Phoenician success story illustrates how crisis can create opportunities for those positioned to exploit them. Their rise was not due to superior military power or political organization, but to their ability to adapt existing skills and resources to new circumstances. Where other Bronze Age civilizations struggled to maintain complex systems that had become unsustainable, the Phoenicians embraced simplification and flexibility. The Bronze Age collapse offers sobering lessons about the fragility of complex civilizations that resonate powerfully in our interconnected modern world. The sophisticated societies of the late Bronze Age possessed many advantages that we might recognize today: advanced technology, extensive trade networks, sophisticated administrative systems, and wealthy urban centers. Yet all of these advantages proved insufficient when multiple crises struck simultaneously. Perhaps the most important lesson is that complexity can become vulnerability. The intricate networks of trade, diplomacy, and specialization that made Bronze Age civilization powerful also made it brittle. When disruptions occurred, they could cascade through the entire system, turning local problems into civilization-wide disasters. The interdependence that was a source of strength in normal times became a pathway for crisis transmission when conditions deteriorated. Modern scholars have drawn explicit parallels between Bronze Age networks and contemporary globalization. Eric Klein, one of the leading experts on the Bronze Age collapse, notes that our current world exhibits many of the same characteristics that made Bronze Age civilization vulnerable. Extensive international trade, complex supply chains, just-in-time production systems, and high levels of specialization. While we have technological capabilities that Bronze Age societies lacked, we also face challenges they never encountered, from climate change to pandemic disease to nuclear weapons. The collapse also demonstrates the importance of resilience versus efficiency. Bronze Age palace economies were remarkably efficient at coordinating resources and maximizing production, but they proved unable to adapt when circumstances changed. The simpler, more localized systems that emerged from the collapse were less efficient, but more resilient. They could survive disruptions that had destroyed their more sophisticated predecessors. This tension between efficiency and resilience remains relevant today. Modern supply chains that minimize costs and maximize profits may prove vulnerable when disrupted by natural disasters, political conflicts, or other crises. The COVID-19 pandemic provided a preview of how quickly global systems can be disrupted when key nodes fail. The Bronze Age collapse also illustrates the role of environmental factors in historical change. The drought that gripped the eastern Mediterranean during the late 13th century BC was not just a local weather pattern, but part of a broader climatic shift that affected vast regions simultaneously. For societies that had grown accustomed to stable environmental conditions, these changes represented an existential challenge. Climate change remains a major concern for contemporary civilization. While we have better technology for monitoring and predicting climatic changes than Bronze Age societies possessed, we also have much larger populations and more complex systems that could be disrupted by environmental shifts. The Bronze Age experience suggests that even advanced civilizations can be overwhelmed when environmental changes exceed their adaptive capacity. The recovery from the Bronze Age collapse was neither quick nor uniform. Different regions followed different paths back to complexity and prosperity, while some areas took centuries to regain even basic features of civilized life. The process reveals important insights about how societies rebuild after catastrophic disruption. In Greece, the recovery took approximately 4 centuries. The Greek Dark Ages lasted from roughly 1100 to 750 BC, during which time population remained low, settlements were small and scattered, and material culture was simple. When Greek civilization began to re-emerge in the 8th century BC, it was based on very different principles from its Mycenaean predecessor. The new Greek civilization that emerged was characterized by city-states rather than kingdoms, alphabetic writing rather than syllabic scripts, and iron technology rather than bronze. Religious practices, artistic styles, and political institutions all showed innovations that had no clear precedents in the Mycenaean world. While Greeks of the classical period preserved some memories of their Bronze Age past, most notably in the epic poems of Homer, they were essentially creating a new civilization rather than restoring an old one. Other regions experienced different recovery patterns. Egypt maintained continuity through the crisis, but never fully recovered its Bronze Age prosperity and international influence. Mesopotamia saw the rise of new powers, like the Neo-Assyrian Empire, but these differed significantly in organization and culture from their Bronze Age predecessors. Anatolia fragmented into numerous small kingdoms that preserved some Hittite traditions while adapting to changed circumstances. The recovery process highlights the importance of cultural memory and institutional continuity. Regions that maintained some connection to their Bronze Age past often recovered more quickly than those where the break was complete. But too much attachment to old ways could also be a liability, preventing adaptation to new circumstances. The role of external contacts in recovery also varied. Communities that maintained some level of trade and communication with other regions often recovered faster than those that became completely isolated. But the most successful recoverers were often those that struck a balance, maintaining enough external connections to benefit from new ideas and opportunities while avoiding the vulnerabilities that had contributed to the original collapse. As we survey our own complex, interconnected civilization, the lessons of the Bronze Age collapse take on urgent relevance. The same forces that brought down the sophisticated societies of the late Bronze Age, climate change, economic disruption, political instability, and pandemic disease, remain powerful factors in our contemporary world. The COVID-19 pandemic provided a stark reminder of how quickly modern systems can be disrupted. Global supply chains that had been optimized for efficiency proved fragile when key nodes were shut down. International trade networks that had grown over decades were interrupted within weeks. Economic systems that had seemed stable revealed unexpected vulnerabilities. Climate change presents perhaps the greatest long-term challenge. While Bronze Age civilizations faced regional droughts and temperature shifts, modern civilization confronts global climatic changes on a scale not seen for thousands of years. Our much larger populations and more complex technological systems may prove even more vulnerable to environmental disruption than their ancient predecessors. The political fragmentation visible in many parts of the world today also echoes patterns from the Bronze Age collapse. International institutions that had provided stability for decades are under strain. Trade wars are disrupting global commerce, and migration pressures are creating tensions reminiscent of the Sea Peoples movements. Yet the Bronze Age collapse also offers reasons for optimism. Human societies have proven remarkably adaptable when faced with existential challenges. The innovations that emerged from the collapse, alphabetic writing, iron technology, new forms of political organization, ultimately created the foundations for even greater achievements. The key to survival, both then and now, appears to be balancing efficiency with resilience. Societies that can adapt to changing circumstances while maintaining core functions are more likely to weather crises intact. This requires difficult trade-offs, accepting some inefficiency in exchange for greater flexibility, maintaining redundancies even when they seem wasteful, and preserving diversity even when uniformity might be more efficient. In the end, perhaps the most poignant legacy of the Bronze Age collapse lies in the clay tablets scattered across the ruins of destroyed cities. These humble documents, fired by the flames that consumed their creator's world, preserve the final testimony of a civilization in its death throes. The linear B tablets from Pylos, with their meticulous records of coastal defenses and military preparations. The desperate letters from Ugarit, chronicling the approach of enemy fleets and the breakdown of ancient alliances. The Hittite diplomatic correspondence, showing the struggle to maintain international relationships as the world dissolved into chaos. All speak to the human desire to maintain order and understanding even in the face of incomprehensible disaster. These anonymous scribes, whose names are lost, but whose work survives, faced the end of everything they knew with remarkable dignity. They continued to write, even as their cities burned, maintained their records even as their societies crumbled, and preserved their knowledge even as their civilizations died. In doing so, they performed the most fundamental human act, the attempt to make meaning from chaos, to preserve something of value for whatever future might emerge from the ruins. Their efforts were not in vain. When archaeologists began excavating Bronze Age sites in the 19th and 20th centuries, it was these clay tablets that provided the keys to understanding vanished civilizations. Linear B was deciphered in 1952. revealing the administrative complexity of Mycenaean Greece. Ugaritic tablets illuminated the cosmopolitan culture of Bronze Age Syria. Hittite archives disclosed the sophisticated diplomacy of ancient Anatolia. In a very real sense, these ancient scribes succeeded in their deepest purpose. They preserved memory across the abyss of civilizational collapse. Their testimony allows us to understand not just what was lost in the Bronze Age collapse, but why it mattered. They remind us that behind the grand narratives of empires and migrations lay individual human beings struggling to comprehend and respond to changes that exceeded their ability to control. The Bronze Age collapse was both an ending and a beginning. It marked the end of humanity's first experiment with complex, interconnected civilization, but it also cleared the way for new forms of social organization that would ultimately prove more durable and adaptable. The Iron Age societies that emerged from the ruins would create innovations: alphabetic writing, coinage, democratic government, monotheistic religion, that continue to shape our world today.